Welcome back to the Superstar Roundup. I am very, very late on this, and honestly my only excuse is that I had a really shitty week, which was then kind of followed up by me burning myself out on Dragon Ball as a whole. It probably couldn't have come at a worse time. We just had 3 action-packed episodes, and judging by some of the tweets I've received over the past couple of weeks, some of you are very anxious to know more about them, so without further ado, let's jump right in. First up is episode 79. This was supervised by Tsutomu Ono, Sawaki Nobariza, and Naoki Tate. Before we get into things, I do need to issue a small correction. Back in episode 74, I had claimed that the episode was outsourced to Studio One Pack. This was because of Tsutomu Ono. In the past, he had popped up next to Yui Kinoshita over and over, and Kinoshita is from One Pack. They work together so much that I had actually assumed that Ono was from there too. Turns out that's not the case, and that's not the case here either. Ono has his own team comprised of some ex-Dragon Ball Z animators like Taichiro Ohara and Yoko Izuka. It doesn't make too much difference to the comments I made in that video about the benefits of outsourcing since they aren't actually Toei staff, but I wanted to just clear that up to prevent some misinformation. So jumping back to episode 79, Ono and Nobariza handle the first half of the episode only. Ono's style is pretty clear, I think. It's quite similar to what we saw in parts of episodes 60 and 74. I don't want to say for 100% just yet, but it does seem to be quite angular and pointy, as I did mention back then too. There are a number of second key animators on board here, so not being 100% sure in his style does make it quite difficult to ascertain what's a pure Ono key and what's been filtered through someone else. Either way, the first half actually does have some surprisingly interesting action. The initial scuffle between Boo and Basil has decent movement, and I really do enjoy some of the fun liberties taken with Boo's form. It's always nice to play around with blobby characters. Although this half is clearly focused on dialogue, what action there is at least serviceable. As we move into the second half, this is where Naoki Tate takes over, and the shift in style and quality is really reassuring. From the get-go, you've got his lovely smoke effects, and just Boo moving his arm up and down has that extra layer of character and fluidity that many fans really appreciate his work for. Something that's also noticeable, and a little surprising to me actually, is just how polished everything is. As we know, episode 72 was a little disastrous due to Tate working so heavily on the new opening and helping out with the Manabe episode slightly earlier. The character art here is really polished, and I think this is one of the few instances where Tate's been able to animate and produce polished work under Super's conditions. There are a few reasons for this, but I think the primary one is that he's only handling one half, and for once, he's not animating absolutely everything. What he is animating is nice, but it's fairly conservative, so let's take a look at that. His first major contribution is the main fight between Basil and Boo. It begins with them rushing at each other, and there are these beautiful plumes of smoke that lead into the impact. The action itself is very conservative, using lots of looped frames, but the effects work masks that and elevates it to a new level. Tate's always good at coming up with interesting shapes to accentuate impact. We cut to a mid-shot now, and you have Tate's signature smears coming into play. It's almost a little too much thanks to Basil's horrible CG aura, but if we break it down, you can see that there's some real choreography here in the sense that Boo is blocking Basil's kicks with some real finesse. This persists throughout most of the scene. You also have Basil jumping up into the air in a way that is so Tate. We've seen similar stuff in Toriko and even earlier on in Super. And the whole thing wraps up with Basil kicking some ki blasts at Boo that results in a pretty cool explosion. Some more nice character art in the dialogue scenes, and the stuff worth talking about wraps up with Boo's key wave, which is either Tate touched up with second key animators or another key animator touched up by Tate. You can see his action lines and the effects match the work found in episode 65, so I think it might be the former. One awesome Gohan glare later, and that is it for episode 79. This was a decent episode and a nice example that conservative can still be interesting in the right hands. So moving on, let's take a look at episode 80. This is part Studio One Pack, part Toei, and as a result, you've got Kinoshita and Manabe supervising. It's also kind of a clusterfuck of an episode, because if we look at the assistant supervisor list, you'll see next to the regular One Pack helpers Kusunoki and Tanaka, you've also got Ono and Tate back, and Osamu Ishikawa. This is the kind of thing that raises a big red flag and tells us that the episode was very rushed. Visually, it's also very obvious too. With so many hands on the episode, there's no consistency in style. It swaps between Manabe, Tsuji, Kinoshita, Tate, and then the various second key animators constantly. There's no defining look to this episode. Despite this, on the whole, it's fantastic. It really is, and it's all thanks to one shining voice that, regardless of who's correcting him, has such a good understanding of action animation and is so speedy in execution that he stands out and single-handedly elevates this entire episode to greatness. This is, of course, the saving grace of Dragon Ball Super, Futoshi Higashide. His first highlight is the part where Lavender rushes at a blinded Gohan, yet Gohan blocks every single punch. It's very short, but it's a prime example of the effortless-looking animation that Higashide is capable of. The next is similar, this time blocking Ki blasts. Not only do we have another example of Higashide's great grasp of movement, but we also get to see his lovely effects. We saw similar stuff back in episode 75, and it's here again. His smoke is very cartoony and has a really nice and distinctive flow to it. You can see how Gohan's swipes are realistically affecting the way that the smoke is pluming. His last highlight, and arguably the most impressive, comes right towards the end of the fight. It's the very nostalgic flurry of punches between the two fighters, which might look like looped animation, but is actually made up of entirely new frames that goes through a full rotation and ends in a terrific Kamehameha. He is absolutely the driving force of this episode, and as I've said many times, he is the glue that is holding Super together. Nobody else in the show works as hard and as fast and produces such consistently great work. I never ever want him to leave the show. But it wouldn't be fair to move on without talking about two other people who really helped pull this episode together. The first is Miyako Tsuji. Again, we know her as one of the chief animation supervisors on the series. You may have noticed that in some of those Higashide clips, it's her corrections that are driving the character art. She seemed to go out of her way to redraw any iffy frames in this episode, so her style can be found in abundance throughout. The next person is Shuichiro Manabe, the primary supervisor on this episode. While he did produce some decent action here and there, it's actually his expressive drawings that I want to talk about. In several places throughout this episode, you have some incredibly detailed, incredibly powerful drawings that are a key factor in selling the drama of this battle. From exaggerated yells to pained expressions, dramatic looks, and even some really disturbing drawings, they're all so well executed and do wonders for this episode. In spite of the time issues that this episode appeared to have, all of the key players really pulled out the stops and produced something I really didn't expect so early on in this arc. So let's move on to episode 81. This is supervised by Joey Kalangian, Noel Año Nuevo, and Masahiro Shimanuki. So we have 2 parts Toei Animation Philippines and 1 part in-house Toei back in Japan. As a result, this is quite the downgrade from last week, and poor Shimanuki and Takeo Ide definitely had their work cut out for them in terms of corrections. Frankly, this should really be called Episode of Ide, considering just how much he did. Alongside these two, we also have some other familiar faces popping up: Yoshitaka Yashima and Yukihiro Kitano, both regular supervisors on the series. Yashima actually did a fair bit, and you can spot his style pretty easily even in spite of corrections in some areas. He was actually on the last 2 episodes too, but pretty unrecognizable. As for Kitano, you can't actually spot him outside of 1 or 2 frames here and there. He seems to have been pretty heavily corrected, and honestly, probably for a good reason. The first of the 2 worthwhile things in this episode comes from Futoshi Higashide. Again, he's back. Unsurprisingly, his work does need cleaning up, and it's Masahiro Shimanuki who handles the bulk of it. As a result, it does take on that typical Shimanuki stiffness, but it's still okay all things considered. The last thing worth talking about is actually by Shimanuki entirely. It's the incredible beam struggle at the end of the episode. It's such a homage to the Goku and Vegeta Kamehameha in the Saiyan arc, and if you've seen my Super Supervisors episode on Shimanuki, you'll know that he was the animator behind that scene. The power-ups, the beams, the rubble, everything is really nostalgic looking, but it doesn't feel dated because the storyboarding is actually quite modern. There's some creative stuff in here that does a good job of keeping the balance right. So while this was definitely a step down from the last 2 weeks, it was still fairly well put together. The second key animators did a good job of keeping the art up to par for the most part. Some raw tap frames did slip through at the end there, but for the most part, it was a serviceable episode. Next week is looking to mark the return of Hiroyuki Itai, who's a relatively new and promising looking addition to Super. Unfortunately, our golden boy Yuichi Karasawa is still missing in action. He was spotted working on another series recently, but that's happened before and he stuck around, so I really don't know. I hope he hasn't left, but if he has, that is a big blow to Super. But that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Again, I am very, very sorry for being so late with this one. Hopefully this more detailed 3-in-1 made up for things. Let me know in the comment section below if you have any ideas for videos in the future, but for now, I will see you next time.